everyone, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. I've received a few requests from students lately to go through a rhetorical analysis prompt and also to show how you can improve an essay from a score of a 120 to a 130 or even a 140. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. This is video 1 in a 2-part series. So let's go ahead and get started and take a look at our prompt. For this prompt, we're going to be looking at President Bush's address to the nation after Hurricane Katrina. I'm going to take you through some of the questions and tips that I give my own students. If you would like to participate along with this video, then check out the description box below. There you will find a forced copy link of this Google Doc so that you can add in your own answers. All right, you can see here we have the prompt, so let's go ahead and read it and then we'll talk about what it says. It says, between August 23rd to 31st, 2005, Hurricane Katrina ravaged the central areas of the Gulf Coast, resulting in the tragic death of approximately 1,500 individuals and causing another 1 million people to be displaced. On September 16, 2005, then President George W. Bush delivered an address to the American public regarding Hurricane Katrina. And a well-developed essay analyzed the rhetorical choices President Bush makes to convey his message. Now, I want to be clear, this is not an official College Board prompt. This is just something that I created. However, I tried to mimic the style that the College Board uses when writing a rhetorical analysis prompt. So for this particular prompt, you can see that we are given some contextual information. For instance, we have the dates of Hurricane Katrina. We also have the date of the speech. So we can see that it took place a couple weeks later. And we know who our speaker is. Notice here that it says then president. So that tells us that he was president at the time, but obviously he's not president right now. Some students might ask, could we call him former president? And technically now he's a former president, but by saying then president, it implies that he was president at the time, whereas former president would imply that he was not president at the time. So just a little clarification there. We also know that we have the American public as the audience of the speech. And as usual, we're being asked to look for rhetorical choices. Remember that rhetorical choices are what the speaker is doing. And then the second part here that's also important is it says to convey his message. So on the exam, you're going to see either achieve a purpose, convey a message, or develop an argument. You want to pay close attention to which one you're being asked to analyze because you want to include the specific message, argument, or purpose in your thesis with those rhetorical choices. And also you want to connect to the message, argument, or purpose in your body paragraphs. We're going to talk about that a lot more in the second video in this series when we actually look at an essay and talk about how to improve the quality of the writing. Now let's go ahead and do a pre-reading exercise together. So again, if you would like to follow along and answer these questions on your own, there's going to be a link to this doc in the description box below. You might be thinking, there's a lot of questions here. Am I supposed to be asking myself these questions on the AP Lang exam? And the answer is possibly, but I don't necessarily think you need to write the answers down. Though I do think it's important for you to read the prompt and determine what you know about the rhetorical situation. For instance, what information is provided. As you saw in the prompt that we're looking at, there are dates that are provided. But also you want to ask yourself, what can you infer about the rhetorical situation and what other background information do you have? It's possible that for some passages that you're going to encounter, you might know more about the speaker or the time period because of history class or your outside knowledge, but it's also possible that you might not, and that's okay too. So let's go ahead and look at these questions for the speaker. So we know the speaker is President Bush. So the first question is, what, if any, relevant information do I know about George W. Bush's presidency? So if you're following along with the video, go ahead and answer this question now. Now, if you saw that question and you're like, I don't know anything at all, that's okay. Or if you feel like your answers are a little bit simple, that's okay too. You might have said that you know that he was a Republican. Maybe you know that he served for 2 terms. Maybe you know that his election was controversial. Maybe you know that his father was president. Feel free to list any of that information in the box to the right. This next question is really important, and it's one that I encourage my students to ask themselves with each rhetorical analysis prompt they have, regardless of who the speaker is. And that is, what are the person's needs, beliefs, or values? So in this case, because we know that he's president, I phrased the question this way. Given his role as US president, what does Bush likely need, believe, or value? If you're following along with the video and you want to answer the question yourself, go ahead and pause now to do so. Now let's think about the audience because we want to examine the speaker-audience connection. Many times there might be complexity or tension within that relationship. So here are some questions I want you to think about for the audience. We know the audience is the American public. So I want you to ask yourself, what would those directly affected by Hurricane Katrina likely want, need, or expect from this speech? Then I want you to ask yourself, what would those who are not directly affected by Hurricane Katrina likely want, need, or expect from this speech? Because even though the audience is the American people, technically speaking, we have at least two subgroups: those who are immediately affected, or maybe who know somebody who's affected, and then those who are not directly affected at all. So go ahead and pause the video now if you would like to write your own answer. I think it's important to recognize that those who were directly affected likely wanted comfort and support, and they wanted to know that their president was going to be helping them. Those who are not directly affected probably wanted to know more information about what was going on, and likely they wanted to know how they could help. Now let's answer the bottom question here. Which relevant traits does the American public value? So, collectively as a whole, what do we as an American public value? And again, this question applies to this particular rhetorical situation, but it could apply to other rhetorical situations as well. So, when thinking about the rhetorical situation, you want to clearly identify who the audience is and think about their needs, beliefs, and values, just like you think about that for the speaker as well. In many cases, they might share similar needs, beliefs, and values, but in some cases, it might differ. Or they might share some of the needs, beliefs, and values, but they might prioritize them slightly differently. This is important to know because speakers tailor their message to their audience. So before President Bush delivered this speech, he had to consider what the audience needed and valued in order to craft his speech more effectively. Now we're going to think about the context and the exigence. These two can be grouped together and also be called the occasion. So I want you to ask yourself, what do you know about Hurricane Katrina? And also ask yourself, what do you know about the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina? Now, it's possible that you might have covered this in history class, or maybe you have relatives who live in the area and you know more information about it. But if you feel like you don't know much at all, that's okay. Just put down a couple bullet points of what you do know. And that's going to complete our pre reading exercise. Again, these are questions that you can ask yourself about pretty much any passage. You'll just have to tailor them to the passage itself, but it can help you think about the rhetorical situation before you actually read the passage. So now let's look at the passage itself. I have it here in the doc. I'm not going to take the time to read it to you, but if you want to take a second to pause the video and read the passage now, you can. What I'd like to do is I would like to show you how I annotate. Now, on the exam, you don't get to use highlighters, unfortunately. However, you do get to have blue and black ink pen. So I have had some students say that they brought one or more of each into the exam. That way they could use blue ink for something and black ink for something instead of highlighter. So if that tip helps you at all, then go ahead and do so. But for right now, we're going to just be using digital annotations, and I tried to color code. So anything in that light red is going to be something that had a more negative connotation, and anything in the light green is going to be something that had a more positive connotation. I think it's important to recognize that annotating in class versus annotating for the exam might look differently. On exam day, if you underline, star, or circle too much, it can be really overwhelming. It can also really help to write in the margins, but let's be honest, sometimes there's not much space in those margins. So it's okay to use bullet points or shorthand. One tip I have for you though, and this just comes from personal experience taking standardized tests, is don't assume you're going to remember something. If you have a good idea, write it down somewhere. That tip has come in clutch for me several times because the first couple times it happened, I thought, oh, that's really great commentary. I'll remember. And then I got to my essay and I didn't. So after that experience, I learned to write it down somewhere and then I would go back to that note. Okay, so let's look at these first couple paragraphs here. The yellow portion after each paragraph, that's just kind of like a bullet point note of the main idea. I find writing a note like that helps me remember what the paragraph is about. In the first paragraph, I highlighted nearly empty, still partly underwater, and waiting for life and hope to return. Notice that I didn't highlight the whole sentence, but I thought those particular phrases could be something that I could embed into a sentence of my own quite easily. Remember that shorter quotes are more effective and easier to embed. I also thought the phrase cruel and wasteful storm would be something that I could integrate into a sentence of my own. Now, as far as the green part, I liked fellow citizens, great and generous nation, and fellow Americans. Because as much as we see that he's talking about the negative effect of the storm itself, we can also see that he's using unifying and patriotic diction to uplift the American audience. Now, remember, in the prompt, it asked us about his message, but it didn't say what his message was. So, as we're reading, we have to figure out what his message is. And some prompts, they're going to tell you the message, argument, or purpose, but in other prompts, they might not. If they do tell you, you want to dig deeper than the provided information. But if they don't tell you, that's one of the things that you need to be thinking about as you read. So you'll notice here in the yellow, I put a note that says begins by acknowledging the tragedy. So that's me answering the question, what is he doing in these couple paragraphs? And I could use that phrasing perhaps in a topic sentence if I wanted to. Now, if you want to read these annotations a bit more closely, they will be in that doc that is linked in the description box below. You can see as it continued, there was more of the green highlighting than the red, which makes sense because presumably he wants to uplift and motivate and inspire the crowd. So even though he has to acknowledge the tragedy, because that's the topic he's talking about, and because the people know it happened, that's why he's making this address in the first place, it's important that he uses these positive words as well. So let's look more closely at what he's doing in these few paragraphs. I liked the phrase marked by acts of courage and kindness that make all Americans proud. Again, we start to see more of that patriotic appeal. Words like courage and kindness stand out as well. And then we have verbs like rescued, welcomed, and invited. These all have a positive connotation. And in this paragraph, he's providing examples of acts of kindness and heroism, which is starting to show the message. These are American ideals. There's a message of hope, resilience, and generosity. Basically, these people rose to the occasion when they needed to do so. Now, with examples, I've noticed that speakers tend to either do one large example or they might have multiple examples. And it seems like here we have multiple examples because we have another one. So in this paragraph, he's talking about a specific first responder here. So he gives his name, Steve Scott of the Biloxi Fire Department, and he quotes him here. Quoting Steve Scott is a choice. And so we have to ask ourselves, okay, why is he quoting this person? Well, this is a person who has lived through this. This is a person who, despite the losses that he has had, still has spirit. So using this person's ethos or credibility, if you will, it helps President Bush convey his message because this person, despite the tragedy that he has faced, has a positive outlook, which would be inspiring for the American audience. So in this case, rather than Bush trying to be inspirational on his own, he includes a quote from someone else who has that lived experience. We see the word spirit again, so that signals to us this idea of the American spirit, hope, resilience, things like that. Then we start to see a bit of a shift, and that's something you're going to want to look for as you read because you want to divide the passage into sections. So he began by acknowledging the tragedy itself. Then he shifted to giving examples of inspiring Americans. And now we see a shift again because he's directly addressing those that are affected. Remember that we said the audience is the American public, but within that, there's two different groups, those that are directly affected and those that aren't. So when he says, to all who carry a burden of loss, I extend the deepest sympathy of our country. To every person who has served and sacrificed in this emergency, I offer gratitude of our country. So he's directly addressing the people who are affected by this particular tragedy. And he is pledging his support, not just for himself, but for the American people as well. So there's a message of we are with you, we are behind you, we are supporting you. So that's why earlier in the pre-reading, I asked, what do the people who are directly affected need in this moment? And it's not one singular thing, but definitely support and quite frankly, also assistance. You can see here that as he concludes this part of the speech, we see more reference to hope because trade is starting to return, the power has been restored. So these are all signs of progress. It's not that things are totally back to normal yet, but we're seeing progress. So in this section, we have to ask ourselves, what is he doing? And I put, he lists the recovery and rebuilding tasks, which highlights the strength and resilience, this unbroken spirit. It reassures the public. And he's also addressing economic and environmental concerns. So again, we're trying to ask ourselves, what is he doing? And we want to connect it to the message as well. Remember that if we're asked about message, it's okay to talk about purpose. So his message is this message of the unbroken American spirit, but his purpose, why he's giving the speech, is to show comfort and support and to inspire those who are going through this incredibly tragic time. And at the very end here, he calls for unity and he calls on the American people to help. So here are just some general notes to kind of recap all the highlighting. He begins by acknowledging the magnitude of the tragedy. This is common when there's been a tragedy. If a president is giving a speech, they need to acknowledge what has happened. Next, he provides examples of the American spirit, which makes sense because that correlates with his message. It's kind of how he introduces his message, is through these examples. So if we're writing an essay and we're talking about these examples, we want to think about why he included these specific examples. Then we see a shift to where he's talking about the recovery efforts. Overall, we have a somber yet uplifting tone, which would make sense because it's a tragedy, but he also wants to inspire and motivate people. If the American spirit is resilient, then we need this uplifting message. And then I wrote what I think the message is, and this could be phrased in multiple ways, but writing out the message can be helpful because when you're writing your essay, you could go back to this. You could put this in your thesis or you could include it in body paragraphs, but it's also a good thing to double check before you move on to writing. You want to ask yourself, okay, what is the message? Or if you're asked about argument or purpose, before going and writing a thesis statement or any other parts of your essay, stop and ask yourself, what is the specific message? So here's what I said. I said the American people are resilient and will not break in the face of such a cruel, devastating tragedy. That concludes day one. In today's video, we talked about how to break down the prompt. We also talked about some pre-reading questions that you could ask yourself before approaching the passage. And I also showed you how I annotate. Granted, these were digital annotations, but I think it's important to, as you read, look for short phrases that you could potentially embed as evidence. And also, I think it can be helpful for students to stop after each paragraph or couple paragraphs and write some kind of bullet point note about what is going on in that particular paragraph or that section. That can help you stay focused on both the choices and the message. I hope you'll join me for day two's video. It'll be linked in the description box below. In that video, we're going to look at the sample essay that I wrote. This particular essay is going to score a 120. So we're going to talk about why it gets that score and also how we can improve that score. So if you find yourself struggling with understanding the rubric, or maybe you feel like you're stuck at a certain score in the evidence and commentary row, please come check out that video because I really think the tips will be helpful for you. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And until next time, happy writing!